On the 17th of March, 1943, within the hushed, wood-paneled confines of an office in Berlin, a German admiral found himself contemplating a report that defied belief. This single sheet of paper, a distillation of raw intelligence, contained revelations more impactful than a 1,000-pound ordnance. It did not detail a new marvel of weaponry or a clandestine military force. Instead, it described a manufacturing facility, an American enterprise situated across an ocean which was projected to soon possess the capacity to assemble a 4-engine heavy bomber every single hour. To the esteemed members of the German High Command, it was nothing short of a jest, a piece of American disinformation so outlandish it merited derision. Yet, for the clandestine operatives who had risked their very existences to procure this information, it represented something far more profound. It was a death decree penned in numerical form. It marked the day they grasped, with an unsettling clarity, that the conflict was irretrievably lost. This is the chronicle of a stark reality too formidable for Adolf Hitler to acknowledge, and how the rejection of one singular fact irrevocably determined the destiny of the Third Reich. Within the very nexus of the Nazi war apparatus, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was an anomaly. As the director of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, he was a man who subsisted and thrived on stark, irrefutable data. Unlike the zealots who constituted Hitler's inner circle, Canaris embodied the disciplined professionalism of a bygone era. He was a career naval officer, a patriot from a different epoch, who perceived the world not through the distorted prism of ideology, but through the unclouded lens of strategic pragmatism. His allegiance lay with Germany, and his mandate was to deliver the unvarnished truth, irrespective of its unpalatability. His organization, the Abwehr, was an extensive network of operatives and analysts dispersed across the globe, serving as the eyes and ears of the German military. In the nascent stages of the war, the Abwehr had been instrumental in Germany's lightning warfare victories, furnishing the crucial intelligence that enabled the Wehrmacht to outmaneuver its adversaries. However, by the early months of 1943, a palpable shift was occurring in Berlin. The war was no longer characterized by triumphant parades. The devastating outcome at Stalingrad had delivered a profound shock. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet war engine was inexorably advancing with terrifying momentum. In North Africa, American and British forces were steadily dismantling Rommel's celebrated Africa Corps. The tide of fortune was unequivocally turning. Despite this evolving landscape, a dangerous illusion of invincibility persisted at the uppermost echelons. Hitler, sequestered within his Wolf's Lair headquarters, was progressively divorcing himself from objective reality, surrounded by sycophants who filtered unpleasant tidings and nurtured his self-deception. He adhered to the conviction that the German war effort was a testament to sheer willpower, that the German soldier was inherently superior, German science indomitable, and victory an assured outcome. Into this echo chamber of self-delusion, Admiral Canaris was about to introduce a jolt of cold, hard reality. He understood the unforgiving arithmetic of warfare, recognizing that modern conflict was not merely a confrontation of armies, but a clash of economies, a brutal calculus of steel, petroleum, and aluminum. From his vantage point at the core of a worldwide intelligence network, he began to discern figures that filled him with dread. Figures that suggested Germany was not only losing the industrial capacity contest, but was on the verge of being overwhelmed by an industrial surge it could not even conceive of. This intelligence did not manifest in a single sudden revelation. Rather, it was a gradual, encroaching unease, painstakingly pieced together from a multitude of disparate sources. It commenced with hushed accounts gleaned by German agents in neutral nations. A businessman returning from the United States spoke of a factory so immense it possessed its own microclimate. A diplomat stationed in Washington reported production quotas that seemed to include an superfluous digit. A Swedish engineer transmitted a coded dispatch concerning an aircraft assembly line operating at the pace of automotive manufacturing. Individually, each report could be readily dismissed. However, as these accounts accumulated within the Abwehr headquarters, Canaris's analysts detected a chilling pattern. They all conveyed the same narrative, all pointed to a single location, a colossal industrial complex in Michigan known as Willow Run. And they all asserted the same seemingly preposterous claim, that the Ford Motor Company was applying automotive mass production methodologies to the assembly of the four-engine B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. The ultimate objective was to eventually produce one such aircraft every single hour. To the German mindset, this was utterly inconceivable. A B-24 Liberator was a formidable machine, a behemoth weighing 18 tons, constructed from aluminum and steel, comprising more than 1.5 million distinct components. German factories, the pride of European engineering prowess, typically required weeks and at times months to manufacture a comparable heavy bomber, such as the Heinkel He-177. The notion that the Americans, a nation frequently caricatured in Nazi propaganda as a disorganized, racially heterogeneous society, could construct such an intricate weapon in 60 minutes was not merely incredible, it was an affront. Canaris and his officers performed the calculations. If the Americans could indeed achieve this feat, one bomber per hour would translate to 24 per day, exceeding 700 per month from a solitary facility. At that juncture, the entirety of the German aviation industry was struggling to produce even a fraction of that quantity of heavy bombers. The intelligence gathered by the spies was corroborated by further details and rigorously vetted. Even Japanese naval attaches, allies of Germany, were transmitting reports concerning American production figures imbued with a palpable sense of alarm. The data was unequivocally sound. But how was this possible? How could a workforce composed of individuals whom the Nazis deemed inferior, women, African Americans, immigrants, achieve such a monumental task? How could a decentralized democracy mobilize with such terrifying focus? Within the prevailing Nazi worldview, strength derived from racial purity and authoritarian control. America possessed neither. Consequently, these reports had to be fabrications, a grand deception. The alternative was too grim to contemplate. It implied that the war was no longer a contest of soldiers or strategists, but a war of industrial might. And if this report from March 1943 foreshadowed a genuine future, it meant Germany had already forfeited the conflict. As one Abwehr officer articulated, should these figures prove accurate, then Germany has already sustained defeat in the war. The decisive factor will no longer be willpower, but rather a matter of mathematics. Half a world away, the impossible was rapidly materializing into a tangible reality. Across a swath of farmland in Michigan, a colossal structure had arisen, the Willow Run bomber plant, the physical manifestation of what President Roosevelt christened the arsenal of democracy. Nothing of its magnitude existed anywhere else on Earth. Conceived by the renowned industrial architect Albert Kahn, the primary building was a singular, expansive chamber so vast that it was acclaimed as the largest enclosed space ever constructed by humankind. It stretched for over a half-mile. To circumvent the imposition of taxes in two separate counties, the assembly line was famously compelled to execute an unusual 90-degree turn, with partially assembled bombers rotating on immense turntables, a feature that subsequently became known as the tax turn. However, the true paradigm shift resided within the operational philosophy. Henry Ford and his production chief, Charles Sorensen, had made a bold, almost audacious pledge. They would manufacture aircraft with the same efficiency as they produced Model T automobiles. The established aviation industry scoffed at this ambition.
"You cannot expect a blacksmith to craft a timepiece overnight," one executive derisively remarked. Ford and Sorensen proceeded to prove them demonstrably wrong. They meticulously disassembled the B-24 into manageable subassemblies. Each worker was rigorously trained for a single, repetitive task. One individual would drill holes, another would repeatedly affix a panel. This approach enabled the plant's apprentice school to generate thousands of new workers weekly. And who comprised this burgeoning workforce? They were a direct refutation of Nazi ideology. At its zenith, Willow Run employed over 42,000 individuals. Nearly one-third of this workforce consisted of women, the iconic Rosie the Riveters, who expertly operated rivet guns and welding torches. One of these women, Rose Monroe, would ultimately become the real-life inspiration for the widely recognized propaganda character. The workforce itself was a vibrant tapestry of American society. More than 9% of the employees were African American, and an additional 3% were classified as disabled. All labored in harmonious unison. They worked in shifts, 6 days a week, their collective endeavor creating a ceaseless 24-hour hum of activity. This was precisely the heterogeneous society that Hitler so frequently disparaged. And these were the individuals poised to surpass the so-called master race in production at a rate that defied all reason. The initial phases of operation were fraught with challenges, earning the plant the moniker "Will It Run?" However, as 1943 progressed, the machinery began to function with remarkable fluidity. Raw materials entered one end of the vast facility, and at the other, an 18-ton heavy bomber emerged, fully prepared for flight. This was not mere propaganda. It represented a novel form of warfare, an industrial juggernaut. And America was deploying a weapon for which the Third Reich possessed no countermeasure. While German scientists diligently pursued futuristic rocket technology, America was perfecting its most potent weapon of all, the assembly line. Armed with this terrifying truth, Admiral Canaris confronted his most formidable obstacle, breaching the ideological fortress that encased Adolf Hitler. This was a bulwark constructed from arrogance and willful ignorance, and its principal architect was the second most influential man in Germany, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Göring, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was a flamboyant World War I ace who perceived himself as the ultimate authority on aerial combat. He was also profoundly corrupt and possessed an exceptionally inflated ego. More than any other individual, Göring was responsible for perpetuating the myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility. When Canaris presented the Abwehr's findings regarding Willow Run, Göring's response was not one of concern, but of outright amusement. The reports were summarily dismissed. "Americans cannot build airplanes," he famously sneered. "They are proficient at manufacturing refrigerators and razor blades." This was not merely a casual remark. It was a succinct encapsulation of the Nazi worldview. In their estimation, Americans were a nation of shopkeepers, a decadent consumer society. They were a mongrel race, lacking the discipline and martial spirit inherent to the German people. The very concept of such a culture being capable of mass-producing a heavy bomber was, in Göring's estimation, simply impossible. He dismissed the intelligence as a clumsy American ploy. One can readily imagine the immense frustration Canaris must have experienced. He was presenting a matter of mathematical certainty to an individual ensconced in a fantasy. He attempted to press the issue, for his agents had provided specific details: the mile-long assembly line, the specialized tooling, the colossal capital investment. Göring refused to entertain the information. He and his inner circle adhered to their own established narrative, an article of faith. To question it was not merely to challenge a military assessment, it was tantamount to heresy. Furthermore, for Göring to acknowledge Canaris's report would necessitate a devastating admission of his own failures. It would imply that his intelligence services had overlooked the most critical development of the war, and that his Luftwaffe was on the precipice of being vanquished from the skies. Consequently, the report vanished without a trace, buried beneath Göring's prodigious ego. The edifice of denial remained unbreached. Canaris was left with knowledge that could have potentially saved Germany, but with no one in a position of power willing to listen. The subsequent step was the ultimate one, to somehow convey the information to the one individual who truly mattered, the Führer himself.
Presenting facts within the Führer's headquarters was a peculiar and perilous undertaking. Whether at the Berghof in the Alps or the Wolfslayer in East Prussia, the atmosphere was oppressive and steeped in paranoia. Reality was whatever Adolf Hitler decreed it to be. Military briefings were less about strategic discourse and more about reinforcing whatever the Führer wished to believe. Into this theater of delusion, the facts emanating from Willow Run constituted a ticking time bomb. Hitler's perception of the United States was a bizarre amalgamation of contempt for its culture and a grudging acknowledgement of its sheer size. He viewed it as a mongrel nation hobbled by racial impurity and controlled by Jewish financiers. When confronted with the production figures from the Abwehr, the projections of 1 bomber per hour exceeding 650 per month from a single facility, Hitler's reaction mirrored Göring's, but with an infusion of pure vitriol. This was not merely a matter of strategy, it was a personal affront to his deeply held ideology. The numbers, he declared, were inflated fantasies, Jewish propaganda. His own Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, a man who possessed a genuine understanding of industrial production, would later admit during Allied interrogations that he was aware that if the Willow Run figures were even half accurate, Germany was doomed. However, to voice such an opinion in Hitler's presence in 1943 would have been an act of professional suicide. Thus, the momentous confrontation never truly transpired. It was a collision between empirical data and entrenched dogma. And within the Third Reich, dogma invariably triumphed. The admiral's warning was not merely disregarded, it was interpreted as a symptom of defeatism. Those who delivered the truth were now viewed with suspicion, their patriotism called into question. In Hitler's perception, the war was a test of sheer will and inherent racial superiority, not of logistical capabilities. A single document, representing the perilous efforts of numerous clandestine operatives, was summarily cast aside. It contained the single most crucial strategic revelation of the war. The enemy's industrial capacity was escalating at a rate Germany could not possibly match. The decision was not made through a formal decree, but through a steadfast refusal to acknowledge reality. The truth was rejected. The spies were discredited. The admiral was silenced. And in that moment of profound ideological blindness, the fate of millions was irrevocably sealed. The repercussions of that denial were inevitable. They began as a distant murmur, then escalated into a terrifying roar that reverberated through the skies above the Reich. Clinging to their self-aggrandizing narratives, the German High Command embarked upon a series of calamitous missteps. They continued to divert vital resources towards Hitler's pet projects, the so-called Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons. The V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket, while technologically advanced, proved strategically inconsequential. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter represented a revolutionary leap, but it arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. The time deficit was critical, as the prophecy of Willow Run was rapidly becoming a reality. Throughout the latter half of 1943 and into 1944, the trickle of Allied bombers evolved into an overwhelming flood. The United States 8th Air Force commenced its relentless daylight bombing campaign. And at the vanguard of this offensive were the B-24 Liberators. The aircraft rolling off the assembly lines in Michigan were now blotting out the German sky. In February 1944, the Allies launched Big Week, a comprehensive assault targeting the German aviation industry. Thousands of bombers, a significant portion originating from Willow Run, pounded factories across Germany. The Luftwaffe scrambled to defend its homeland only to be systematically decimated. German pilots, however valiant, were simply overwhelmed. For every German fighter lost, only a handful of replacements were available. For every American aircraft downed, 10 more were traversing the Atlantic. It was a brutal war of attrition, precisely the scenario that Canaris had foreseen. The cities that Göring had confidently asserted would never be bombed were reduced to smoldering ruins. A Luftwaffe general, weary of Göring's detachment from reality, confided in his diary, "The Reichsmarschall lives in a fantasy. Yesterday, 1,000 American bombers destroyed Linz." He still insists they could not have produced so many aircraft. The B-24s that emerged from the most immense room in human history were now systematically dismantling the Third Reich piece by piece. They annihilated factories, crippled railway networks, and obliterated oil refineries. The German war machine, starved of fuel, began to falter and grind to a halt. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht was being pounded into submission by the output of a single factory whose leaders had so readily dismissed it. What then became of the man who had attempted to sound the alarm? For Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the cost of speaking truth to power proved exceedingly high. As the war increasingly turned against Germany, his sober assessments marked him as a man not to be trusted. Within Hitler's paranoid court, adherence to realism was increasingly construed as a form of treason. His rivals within the SS viewed the Abwehr as a hotbed of untrustworthy old-world aristocrats who lacked genuine Nazi fervor. They monitored his activities, awaiting any misstep. His accurate reports concerning American industrial capacity were not merely disregarded. They were interpreted as evidence that Canaris himself was propagating enemy propaganda. He was ensnared. To perform his duties was to appear disloyal. However, Canaris's dissent extended far beyond mere intelligence assessments. Horrified by the atrocities perpetrated by the SS, he utilized the Abwehr to safeguard members of the German resistance, including the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He also clandestinely worked to prevent Spain from joining the Axis powers, an act of sabotage that inflicted significant strategic damage upon Hitler. The final blow arrived in the aftermath of the failed July 20, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler. The Gestapo investigation unearthed an extensive network of opposition, and numerous threads led directly to the Abwehr. Canaris was apprehended. His personal diaries were discovered, revealing the true depth of his antipathy towards the regime. On the 9th of April 1945, during the war's final, chaotic weeks, a vengeful Hitler issued an order. At the Flossenburg concentration camp, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, stripped bare, was slowly strangled to death with piano wire. It was a brutal, humiliating end for the man who had possessed the clarity to foresee the future with such precision. He was murdered by the very regime he had endeavored to shield from its own self-inflicted blindness. He delivered his crucial message, and in return for his efforts, he was expunged. When the cessation of hostilities occurred in May 1945, the final figures definitively underscored the accuracy of Canaris's pronouncements. The report that had graced his desk in 1943 was not only precise but even an understatement. The ultimate production tally for Willow Run was staggering. At its absolute peak in 1944, the plant was producing a B-24 Liberator not every hour, but every 63 minutes. By the time the last aircraft rolled off the assembly line, Ford had manufactured 6,972 complete B-24s at Willow Run and produced an additional 1,893 knockdown kits for assembly elsewhere. Consider this. A single American manufacturing facility produced more four-engine heavy bombers than the entire German aviation industry managed to build throughout the entire duration of the war. The disparity was not even comparable. Across all its factories, the United States manufactured over 18,400 B-24 Liberators, establishing it as the most extensively produced heavy bomber in history. From 1940 to 1945, the U.S. produced in excess of 300,000 military aircraft. Germany, during the same period, manufactured approximately 94,000 combat aircraft. The American industrialist William S. Lieber, Knudsen aptly summarized the situation. We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible. Germany's failure to accept this reality was not a deficiency in its espionage capabilities. German agents had performed their duties admirably. They had procured the intelligence. The failure lay in an inability to accept it. It was a complete cognitive collapse at the highest echelons, an inability to process facts that directly contradicted a fanatical ideology. The Nazi leadership, blinded by their own self-serving propaganda, simply could not reconcile the numbers. They were defeated not by a secret weapon, but by basic arithmetic. They were buried beneath an overwhelming tide of steel and aluminum, forged by the very people they so readily disdained. Men and women of diverse backgrounds, united in a free society. The spies had been correct. The admiral had been correct. The 17th of March, 1943, was the day the truth arrived in Berlin, and no one in power was willing to heed its message. Narratives like this underscore how history is frequently shaped by moments far removed from the battlefield, occurring in quiet offices where a single sheet of paper can fundamentally alter the course of events. If you find satisfaction in uncovering the hidden stories that have shaped history, please ensure you are subscribed to the channel and activate the notification bell to avoid missing our subsequent investigations. Your likes and shares of these videos with others who appreciate compelling stories significantly aid our work. Ultimately, the story of Willow Run transcends a mere historical anecdote from World War II. It offers a chilling glimpse into how any government, any group, or indeed any individual can become ensnared by their preconceived notions and desires. The Third Reich was not defeated for a lack of information. It was defeated because its leaders chose to prioritize their prejudices over verifiable facts. They constructed their worldview upon the unstable foundations of racial mythology, and when the overwhelming tide of mathematical reality surged forth, their entire edifice crumbled and was washed away. The conflict between the Abwehr's grim reports and the arrogant dismissals from Hitler and Goering represented a battle for the very soul of the German war effort, a struggle between empirical evidence and baseless fantasy. Fantasy ultimately prevailed, thereby dooming the entire enterprise. Willow Run, in contrast, stands as a testament to the very principles that Nazism sought to eradicate: the power of a diverse, free society to mobilize and innovate on a scale that totalitarianism could never hope to achieve. Within the bustling expanse of the manufacturing facility, a miniature representation of the collective Allied effort unfolded. It was a jumble, a disarray, a breathtaking spectacle of human endeavor, which, upon coming together, accomplished the extraordinary. Consequently, the enduring impact of that singular day in March of 1943 resonates across the ages. This serves as a profound illustration that the most insurmountable barriers are not constructed from physical materials like stone and cement, but are instead the conceptual fortresses we erect within our own consciousness.